This is a Stories to be Told podcast. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stories to be Told, the podcast series. I'm Tracy DW, founder and creator of Stories to be Told, an online multimedia educational platform all aimed at engaging all learners from 9 years and up interested in understanding more about the history of the British Empire, otherwise known as Britain's colonial past. I'm looking out of my window at home as I'm recording this episode, and it is a beautiful sunny April evening. We are about to go into the weekend. We are coming to the end of formal lockdown. It's so lovely to have the shops and the amenities all open again. Everything is coming back to life. It's like a springtime of living again, and it's so good to be out and to be able to meet up with friends and loved ones, still at a distance, still with face masks on in some particular cases. But I'm sure you're feeling the same way as I am right now. Just this feeling of gratitude to be alive, to be well, to be fit and healthy, and just to be really excited and hopeful and positive about the way forward. So really looking forward to June the 21st, as I'm sure you all are as well. If this is your first time joining us, I want to give you a huge welcome to our podcast series and the growing community. And if you're a regular listener and you've come back for more, then thank you so much for your continued support with this project. Stories to be Told is all about providing a balance of perspective on history, as what is often presented as fact always needs to be balanced with another perspective. And whatever you've been told about history, there's always another story and many perspectives related to it. And what I try to do is to discuss and explore some of these perspectives in my own podcast series. Now, as I clarify in every episode, there's always a disclaimer. My podcasts do not aim to be the ultimate or only authority on the subject or topic under discussion, but I'm simply sharing what I've learnt, and I hope that it will provide enough information to stimulate your own curiosity to find out more by beginning your own learning journey about the subject and decide for yourself if history is a matter of fact or perspective. This podcast complements another future poetic narrative to be published about the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, as I said in the previous podcast, Victorian Revolutionaries, several people have asked me, when are we going to see more published poetic narratives? Well, let me remind you of my 4 current published titles: Caribbean Wind, a celebration of the arrival of H.M. Windrush in 1948, and an ode to the Windrush generation; Caribbean Rush, which is an account of England's early encounter with the Caribbean islands; Knights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884, which tells of the scramble for Africa; and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change, all about Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's speech in 1960, which was prophetic about the rise of nationalism across the colonies and the end of Britain's empire. These are all available in ebook, Kindle and paperback formats at storiestobetold.com, our website, and also on Amazon. I'm pleased to announce, as I said before, that more titles will be published later on in the year, and of course I will share some anecdotes and some readings from these through another couple of Stories So Far podcast episodes. So there is so much more to come. In this podcast, I want to shed some light on more of our forgotten heroes. Those men and women of African descent and from other ethnicities who fought side by side with the British during the Battle of Trafalgar, but also recognise the wider contribution of their role throughout the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815. These wars were a series of conflicts between Napoleon Bonaparte and his French Empire against an array of Allied powers, which changed over phases of time. These Allied groups always included Britain, and the Battle of Trafalgar, fought off the Cape of Trafalgar, Spain, between Cadiz and the Strait of Gibraltar, established Britain's naval supremacy for the next century. So, let's get into some core knowledge. The 21st of October 2020 marked the 215th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. This battle off the coast of Spain between a British fleet, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, against a combined fleet of French and Spanish ships, led by Admiral Villeneuve, saw Britain victorious due to Nelson's superior leadership, training, and ability to muster team morale on board his ships. The historical significance of this battle not only ensured that Britain was safe from any further or future French invasion, but it also marked Britain and recognised it as a superior naval power on a global scale. Nelson and his crew were outnumbered, but they were able to sink 19 enemy ships in 5 hours. Nelson was mortally wounded on his ship HMS Victory by a French marksman, and his tragic death and Trafalgar became part of a national narrative inspiring many works of art, such as the Death of Nelson portraits by Arthur William Dennis, 1805-9, and Benjamin West, 1806. The victory was commemorated at Trafalgar Square in London in 1844, with a column at its centre. In 1849, bronze reliefs were installed at the base of the columns, depicting scenes from the battle. One relief shows the African George Ryan on the far left. What is his story, and other Africans like him, and what were the roles they played in the battle? How was the presence of Africans and other ethnicities felt, acknowledged and recorded in the Royal Navy? How were they actually enrolled into the Royal Navy? Well, the ugly truth of the matter is that they were often press-ganged off the American, Caribbean and African coastlines, as well as in the East Indies, or enlisted from the African population already resident in Britain. Their roles ranged from deckhands to serving as sailors and servants to admirals and officers. Due to a landmark case in 1772, it was deemed an illegal practice under common law in England to forcibly take an African out of the country. This set a legal precedence that saw the sea as a kind of no man's land where either free or enslaved Africans could be subject to better treatment, and they often viewed joining the Navy as a way of finding some form of freedom. The most well-known African sailor to serve as an enslaved and as a free African has to be Olaudah Equiano, circa 1745 to 1797, who has written extensively about his life as a sailor and incidentally encountered a 14-year-old Horatio Nelson on board the HMS Racehorse back in 1773. This ship, along with another ship, HMS Carcass, were both due to depart for an exhibition to the Arctic in search of a passage to the east. Unfortunately, the expedition had to be abandoned due to both ships becoming trapped in thick ice. It is difficult to identify in most cases who these Africans and sailors of other ethnicities were. Why was this? The problem was the inconsistent record-keeping of logbooks on board many of the ships. The Royal Navy did not differentiate between Africans and Indians, often referring to them as black or coloured. On the ship which Nelson directly commanded, the HMS Victory, 22 ethnicities were recorded in its logbook, showing that around a third was ethnic or non-British. HMS Victory also had the worst fatality of any of the British ships, with 57 deaths and 102 wounded. However, other sources, such as portraits and family records, were also used for identification. The logbooks also identified the nationalities of many foreign Europeans. There were Italians, Germans, Maltese, Norwegians, Russians, Brazilians, and even a handful of French volunteers. Looking at this from another perspective, the fact that a significant proportion of the crew were from a diverse range of backgrounds and nationalities reveals the British Royal Navy as a major equal opportunities employer. Now, this could have been something completely unique and way ahead of its time. Did the British Royal Navy view this diversity as a kind of ideal, a type of norm? And was it something that Nelson was particularly proud of? I think this not only gave them a possible advantage over their opponent, but this could be perceived as the real victory behind Nelson's success. However, you have to wonder whether a Frenchman fighting for the opposition against his own country might be hesitant about this and feel a sense of betrayal. But if you were being paid to carry out a job which was dependent on life and death, as well as victory or defeat as the outcome, then it would be the camaraderie that unified these men, rather than race or nationality dividing them. Despite this camaraderie, the records of the logbooks that are in existence indicate that it was rare to non-existent to have an African rise above the rank of an ordinary seaman, but they were all on the payroll and received payment and possibly their freedom. It has also been assumed for a long time that it was unlucky to have women on board a ship, but women were portrayed on the deck of the ship in the Death of Nelson painting, and those who held more senior positions on board sometimes had their wives with them. There was also a highly able sailor who went by the name of William Brown, who served for nearly 11 years on the HMS Charlotte and rose to the rank of captain before being discovered to be a woman. These pieces of evidence contradict the myth that a woman on board a ship always brought trouble. Some of the most reliable sources were parish records, and possibly the most significant resource was the record of the black pensioners at Greenwich Hospital, which kept a record of retired sailors between 1692 and 1869. These records show the age, date of birth, length of service, and service details of the ships' names on which they served, the type of injury sustained, as well as place of residence and marital status. 20,000 pensioners were interred at Greenwich Naval Hospital Old Burial Ground. When the hospital closed in 1875, their remains were moved to East Pleasance Park in East Greenwich, with a memorial built on the original burial ground. I wonder how many of those sailors were black, African, or of ethnic descent. And how can we find out? Let's try to get a political and colonial perspective on this period, leading up and during the Napoleonic Wars. George III was the monarch at this time, and his reign was marked by American colony rebellion through the Boston Tea Party in 1773 and the eventual War of Independence in 1776. Following the first parliamentary motion against the slave trade in 1789 and the first parliamentary vote against the slave trade in 1792, British Parliament saw several PMs or Prime Ministers come and go, leaving their mark. William Pitt the Elder, 1766 to 68, is credited with coining the term British Empire after leading successful campaigns in Canada, India, the West Indies and West Africa, creating highly lucrative trades. We also saw the youngest PM at the age of just 24 years in his son, William Pitt the Younger. Lord Frederick North, 1770 to 82, led England into the War of Independence and was blamed for its defeat. William Wyndham, 1806 to 1807, oversaw legislation abolishing the slave trade in 1807, and Spencer Perceval, 1809 to 1812, was the only British PM to be assassinated. European colonial activity saw the greatest African rebellion in history through the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which was a huge blow to France's and Napoleon's colonial ambitions. Although England had acquired this island from Spain in 1655, the Second Maroon War in Jamaica, 1795 to 1796, saw England unable to break the Maroon stronghold over the island. As well as capturing Port-au-Prince in Haiti, Martinique and Trinidad, the Treaty of Vienna after the War of 1812 against America confirmed England's retention of Tobago, St. Lucia and Guyana. Following Captain Cook's 3 expeditions to the South Pacific in 1766 to 1780, there were also expeditions to the South Pacific by Colnett in 1793 to 94. The first voluntary European settlers to arrive in Australia happened in 1795, and 2 years later, the London Missionary Society sent its first missionaries to the South Pacific region. Before I conclude this podcast, I'd like to leave you, as I always do, with some questions for thought and discussion. Even though Nelson had pro-plantation attitudes, he showed exemplary leadership and respected every member of his crew. In what ways did he show this? What other reliable sources can we use to find out more about the life and contribution of men and women who served in the Napoleonic Wars, who were from Africa and other ethnic backgrounds? And what was life like for many of these Africans after leaving the Navy? Were they recipients of pensions and rewards? Or was this an exception rather than the rule? If you liked this podcast, then stay on my website or this listening platform and check out my other podcast episodes, The Story So Far and The Story So Far Part 2, where I share some anecdotes about my thought processes and experiences of writing my poetic narratives, and also perform a reading of an extract from each of my current published titles. Don't forget you can visit storiestobetold.com for mini documentaries, our alternative history gallery and learning journeys, all linked to the content of my work. Once again, it has been a pleasure and a privilege to be able to share my learning journey with you in this podcast, and I encourage you always to either begin or continue your own. History is a matter of fact or perspective. Thanks so much for listening. Stay safe, stay well, stay blessed, and I'll see you on the next page.